Fletcher is an associate professor and academic director of the Community Engagement and Research Center of the University of Regina. Her research examines how gender and social inequality shape the lived experience of climate change through the lens of climate disasters, flooding, drought, and wildfire, focusing on rural and Indigenous communities in the Canadian Prairie region. Her work reveals the lived impact of inequality in the context of crisis. She's the lead researcher for a major study on the social dimensions of climate hazards in Saskatchewan's farm forestry and First Nations communities, and co-edited Women in Agriculture Worldwide, Key Issues and Practical Approaches from 2016. In 2012, she spoke at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women on the topic of rural women's well-being. She's a past president of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, 2018 to 2019, and holds 2 Governor General's medals from her research and advocacy on gender equality in Canada. In addition to her university teaching, she is also always interested in partnering with community and nonprofit organizations with research questions or data needs. Dr. Fletcher, I welcome you to present. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I would like to thank the NFU and to all of the organizers of this panel. And thanks to all of you for being here today. It's wonderful to see you all, even if virtually. So my name is Amber Fletcher. I'm an associate professor at the University of Regina in sociology. And the title of my talk today is Connecting Neoliberalism, Climate Change, and Gender in Agriculture. I'm just going to adjust my video here so I can see my slides. There we go. And so what I'd like to do with my talk today is to really try to bring together these 3 themes: neoliberalism, climate change, and gender, and in particular to show how a neoliberal political economic structure has had impacts in how we approach climate change and has also had gender impacts as well. And so these big structural changes intersect with gender relations in everyday life. And those are the connections that I would like to make. So I'll begin by just introducing myself briefly. So I grew up on a farm in rural Saskatchewan, and I think if I think about it, I've probably always been interested in how major changes affect the micro level of lived experience on the farm. I'm particularly interested, of course, in how climate extremes like wildfire, flooding, and drought impact agriculture and rural communities. And I've shared some pictures with you on the slide here from our own family farm and some of the recent challenges we experienced with a flood event in 2014. So just as an overview of my presentation today, I want to start with just a brief summary of some of the research projects that I've been involved with for approximately the past 10 years. And these are the projects that I'll be drawing on for my presentation today. I'll be sharing with you some of the voices of the hundreds of farmers that I've interviewed during these projects, and sharing with you some of the key themes that have come out of these projects, specifically as it pertains to neoliberalism and to climate change and gender. So I want to start, first of all, by highlighting some of the aspects of neoliberalism that through my research I've found to be particularly salient for farmers, and then to talk just briefly about how our approach to climate change has also been shaped by neoliberalism. From there, I want to look at some of the gendered impacts of this and to conclude briefly with some of the responses and resistance as well. So that's the overview. So the first project that I'll be drawing from today was actually done quite a few years ago, almost 10 years ago. And this was a project that focused on farm women's experiences of flooding and drought. The second project is a large intercontinental study looking at rural people's adaptation to climate extremes in 4 countries of South America and also in Canada as well. The third project from 2015 to 2018 was looking at barriers and opportunities for not only producers, but also small scale processors and distributors of food in Saskatchewan's local market. The fourth project, which has taken a significant amount of my attention over the last few years, has been a large-scale study of the experiences of flooding, drought, and wildfire hazards in rural and Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan. And finally, a recent project done in partnership with the Faculty of Business and the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, which looked at barriers and opportunities for women, not only in primary production, but also in other aspects of the agricultural sector, from communications to finance. So these are the projects that I'll be drawing on for my presentation today, sharing with you some of the key findings from these studies drawn together. And I would say that if I had to summarize the most significant theme across all of these projects and all of the interviews that I've done with agricultural producers and other folks in agriculture, it would be a theme of uncertainty and loss of control. And I see this uncertainty that I hear about over and over again from farmers as related to three different areas of stressors. So the first area would be the political economic. In this regard, the cost price squeeze, the exacerbated cost price squeeze, continues to be a major stressor for the farmers that I speak with. They talk about income variability. They talk about lacking control over the conditions of their production, from seed to the increasingly difficult to predict weather. They talk about the industrialized get big or get out export-oriented system in which they find themselves and the stressors that causes, including an impetus to take more debt simply to stay in agriculture. In terms of the environmental aspects, of course, we know that anthropogenic or human-caused climate change is causing increasing climate extremes, from wildfire to flooding to drought. But that also we're having areas of Canada experiencing unfamiliar extremes that they are not adapted to because they are new, and experiences that they are having to quickly learn to cope with. The farmers I speak with also tell me about the challenges of having a rapid interchange of extremes, having a drought year follow hot on the heels of a previous extreme the year before, and how challenging that can be for them. In terms of the social, it's issues that probably all of you in this room are familiar with. Issues like rural depopulation, the loss of infrastructure, from social infrastructure to businesses to schools, conflict over land and land grabbing, and a general lack of social recognition, a lack of appreciation in Canadian public discourse generally for farmers and the work that they do. So all of these things have come up as major stressors in all three areas. But it's gender barriers that I would particularly like to talk about, because this is something that does come up as a social stressor, but it's one that is very much related and affected by the two other areas, the political economic and the environmental. So I want to start first by talking about political economic stressors. And the current stressors that I have learned about through my research are very much encompassed or associated with what I would describe as a neoliberal political economic structure, a neoliberal policy paradigm in agriculture. David Harvey has defined neoliberalism as a set of ideas and policies that suggest human well-being can best be advanced within an institutional framework that's characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. I would suggest that neoliberalism in agriculture primarily takes the form of cuts to social supports, to safety nets, to market controls, and that the overall deregulation, the removal of those kinds of supports, largely due to the demands of international trade, free trade agreements, has been a significant form that neoliberal policy takes. But I would suggest that it goes beyond cuts and deregulation to what I would describe as re-regulation in the agriculture sector. And when we talk about re-regulation, we're talking about a new form of policy, not just the removal of policy like we see with deregulation, but the actual imposition of new policy frameworks, increasingly advocated for by private actors, large multinational corporations in the sector that seek to actually increase their power and control. And so this is something that I'll come back to in just a moment. I think it's not difficult rather, to spot the evidence of cuts and deregulation, of the removal of market controls and social safety nets in agriculture. We've seen it in the elimination of many different programs, which the NFU has done a great job of spotlighting. Things like the elimination of the crow rate, federal safety nets, the PFRA, the Canadian Wheat Board, and the Community Pastures Program, all of which have been part of this deregulatory approach that is so characteristic of neoliberalism, and again, which is often associated with the demands of free trade agreements. I would use plant breeders' rights and seed patenting as a primary example of how re-regulation occurs. So again, this is not just the elimination of policy, this is the actual implementation of new policy frameworks, which actually govern what farmers can and cannot do, and which are increasingly facilitated by international agreements like the UPOV, the TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which have been advocated for and significantly pushed by private interests like biotechnology firms, large agricultural corporations in the seed sector. And I would suggest that these actors, and something that I've done in my own research, is to sort of track the increased power, voice, and presence of these private actors in the policy formation. And noting that they serve as policy entrepreneurs who advocate for and shape policy in their own interests. And there has been, if we look at the different task forces and different boards that have advocated for this kind of policy, it's very much, we are seeing over the years an increased presence of those private firms who are doing this kind of policy entrepreneurship. And of course, these kinds of policy frameworks are very, very beneficial for those actors. And this is, the farmers that I interview tell me about what this political economic structure has, the impact that it has had on their lives. One Saskatchewan farmer said, and I quote, "Between seed companies with herbicide tolerant seed programs and chemical companies, any chance of profitability for farmers is very quickly eaten up." Another farmer told me that the current system is just taking the power and control away from farmers so much, it gets to the point where you've got them backed into a corner. End quote. And so here we see again that theme of power and control that is so prevalent throughout the research that I have done. I think we can also see it if we look at data on farm income. And we often hear, if we read, popular mainstream news articles, we often hear about how farm incomes are increasing and the average farm income is going up. But here are some data that I pulled together from various Statistics Canada sources and put into this chart. And I think if we look here, this is showing net farm income Canada-wide from 1981 to 2021. I think we see that although that trend line might be increasing in terms of the average income, we are seeing dramatic variability. Apologies, my office phone is ringing. It never rings, so perfect timing. And I think what we're seeing here is dramatic variability and an increase in variability, which of course has significant impacts at the farm level and significant stressors. And I would argue that this is ultimately linked to the kind of neoliberal aspects that I've just been talking about. So I want to talk just briefly about how even our response to climate change has been affected and influenced by neoliberal approaches and neoliberal ideology. Of course, I think it's quite apparent that neoliberalism and its associated impacts have fueled climate change in many ways, but our dominant approach to coping with and adapting to climate change has also been influenced by the values of a neoliberal paradigm. I would argue that current climate adaptation is increasingly framed by what we would call a technocratic approach, an approach that emphasizes calculability and technology and infrastructure as the solutions to climate change. And it's this approach, the dominant approach, that I would argue speaks to what Zaytoun and colleagues have called a reductionist approach to climate adaptation that seeks to represent uncertainty through an attempt to calculate through calculable risk that overlooks the social aspects, the diversity, the complexity of climate change and its impacts. We see this, for example, in the creation of drought-resistant GM seed, which of course is promoted as a solution to climate change and a way to adapt. We see it in that farmers are increasingly impelled to diversify their livelihood to help them adapt, which of course has impacts at the farm level in terms of people's stress and their well-being. Many farmers have been forced to expand and continually expand as an individual level adaptation strategy to climate change. And I would argue that all of this forgets or neglects the social impacts of what this all means for producers in their everyday life. I also hear from the farmers I speak to about how, although a drought-resistant seed might be helpful, and this is not to say that technology doesn't have its place, it certainly does, but an overemphasis and overdependence on these kind of adaptation solutions can be dangerous, because as they tell me, a more expensive crop seeded with an attempt to adapt to expected future climate change can ultimately result in a more expensive crop lost to a climate disaster that was not anticipated. And so I'd like to, with the last section of my presentation today, talk about some of the gendered impacts of this. Of course, when major financial crises and major climate crises impact agriculture, they impact the everyday lives of farmers. And I would argue that these major forms of change and crisis intersect with gender inequality at the micro level to create different experiences for farm women and for farm men. The farm women that I talk to often speak about how they don't feel in control of their own labor. As one woman put it, she said, "I'm the one that just gets told, go harrow that field. So I feel like I'm, the employee." And in fact, this is a common theme, even in the very recent interviews that I've done with women in agriculture, that their work is often positioned, sometimes even by themselves, as helping, as being an employee, being a go for this, go for that. And that these roles, although they are so important and necessary and central to agriculture, continue to be seen as peripheral and as marginal and as somehow less valued in the broader social imagination. They also tell me that because of this relative disconnection from the locus of farm control, that they tend to have less control and less voice over farm adaptation choices, the kind of day-to-day adaptation choices that are happening all the time for farms that are facing climate disasters and climate change. And one of the most significant themes that they tell me about is the amount of emotional labor that farm women are doing for their families, for their communities, as families and communities are responding to crisis, whether it's related to the financial impacts of neoliberalism, whether it's related to a wildfire, a flood, or a drought. Women are holding the families and communities together with their emotional labor. And of course, that can be very exhausting and stressful for them. One Saskatchewan farm woman told me, and I quote, "We women try and keep everybody on the level and, don't try to irritate them. Try to keep it a peaceful atmosphere, like maybe tomorrow will be better." Another woman I interviewed very recently actually commented directly on emotional labor and the gendered aspects of this. She said, "Women do all the emotional labor of running a household. I think that it still falls primarily to the female. Is that changing? Yes. Has it changed in our family over the years? Yes. But I'm still the one who thinks of what goes on in the house." And so again, we see the gendered impacts of when things are challenging, this emotional labor mechanism is activated, and it's primarily women who are filling that role. There's also still gender divisions of labor that the women I speak with tell me about. One woman said, "If you want to be involved in agriculture, you still have your more traditional duties that are expected of you. You certainly didn't see a lot of men in agriculture say, 'I have to go home and take care of the kids today, so I can't go out and do the field work.' Whereas that wasn't even an option for me. I had to figure out how to make it work." And so it's these kinds of gendered structures that continue to exist. And it's not just in agriculture, and it's not just in rural communities. These exist everywhere. But because rural communities and farms are hit so hard by crisis after crisis and disaster after disaster, these kinds of roles become particularly elevated, prominent, and sometimes reinforced. But I think it's also important to note that gender does not just equal women. Men are affected because of gender when these kinds of crises occur. I hear from both the women and the men that I interview about how psychologically difficult disasters can be for men who, as men, are impelled to be the providers, to be the supporters, to be the main farmer. And so although that power, that day-to-day control that they have as the main farmer or the central farmer may be very powerful when times are good, it can also be very, very challenging for them when times are bad. And so as one rancher, a man, told me, he said, "I think women will definitely reach out more. Men, a lot of times, the men are more introverted. They'll just clam up and hole up." And so men often told me about this phenomenon of how it would, because of masculinity, and I'm certainly not suggesting that this is in any way a natural characteristic of men, just as I would never claim that emotional labor is a natural characteristic for women. These are socialized and socially constructed roles. But men often talked about how this phenomenon is widespread, where men during difficult times do not feel capable of or able to reach out for support and help, because that goes against our dominant ideas of what men should be. One Saskatchewan rancher said, and I quote, "If you don't see somebody in town or around the community very much, then that's when you're starting to get worried, get concerned with them, because they're not exposing themselves to others very often." And this was distinctly a gendered phenomenon. I think it's very important, though, at the same time, to recognize that when these kinds of gendered stressors are happening, again, it is women who tend to be providing the emotional labor, the emotional support. And so we always need to be asking ourselves that question of who is supporting the supporters. At the same time, and just to wrap up, it's also important, I think, to note that resistance is happening, that a push for change is happening, that farmers are pushing back against these big structural changes and doing their best to make positive change. And I think it's marginalized perspectives like those of women who are less likely to be socially recognized as farmers that can actually have a significant impact in positive change moving forward. One of the women I interviewed said, and I quote, "We women don't want to wreck the world. You want to keep it for your children. You've got to think of the 7 generations before and the 7 generations to come. You don't just think about yourself." And I think that because of the aforementioned sort of disconnection that women have told me about, that they feel that they don't have that same locus of control in the farm, I think at the same time, it affords them the ability to step back and to look critically at some of the things that are happening in agriculture and some of the ways that these big systems are affecting the environment and livelihood on the farm. And so their critical perspective is important, and it's valuable. And I think that's something that can ultimately lead change, is that critical perspective. And so I just want to conclude with this quote from one of the farmers I've interviewed, because I think it perfectly summarizes the kind of positive resistance that's happening against the neoliberal paradigm. A farmer said to me, and I quote, "We're seeing increasing corporate control of the food system, and we don't think that's right. We want to establish, protect, and maintain institutions in Canada that promote democratic control of our food by farmers and by the people that eat the food." And so I'd like to thank all of you in this room for being part of that promotion of democratic control. That's it. Thank you so much, everyone. I just want to acknowledge my research team and the funders, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for funding my research, the Queen Elizabeth Scholars Program, and the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher.